Initiating the English opening immediately challenges black's central control and sets a flexible, transposable game. Challenging the center directly, this response immediately creates a rich, dynamic pawn structure ripe for tactical skirmishes. Foisting the g-pawn forward prepares a kingside fianchetto, aiming for indirect pressure on black's center and a potentially safer king shelter. Developing the knight to f6 controls key central squares while preparing for kingside castling. The bishop now eyes the long diagonal, creating pressure and preparing for castling into safety. Asserting central presence, this knight immediately contests the d4 square, preparing for potential pawn advances and enhancing piece harmony. Developing a piece towards the center while solidifying control of key squares and preparing for kingside castling. Developing the bishop's fianchetto solidifies the kingside and prepares to eye the long diagonal, but may create a slight queenside initiative for white. Developing the knight here secures the center and prepares castling, a sensible piece of coordination. Black solidifies their fianchetto, developing a piece to its natural square and preparing for castling, a common response in this symmetrical setup. Challenging the center immediately, white boldly injects pawn pressure, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious development and potentially pry open lines for attack. Capturing the pawn on d4 offers immediate central presence, but sacrifices the tempo gained by white's pawn push. This exchange opens lines and injects dynamism into the position, forcing black to consider the consequences of the newly exposed diagonal. The piece development must now be swift and purposeful to counter white's growing influence. Reclaiming the central pawn with your knight initiates a sharp tactical confrontation, aiming to exploit black's slightly underdeveloped queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines towards their king. Securing the king is paramount, and this timely maneuver beautifully tucks the monarch away to safety while activating the rook's potential for future action along the open files. Castling now fortifies the king's security, mirroring black's earlier decision and creating a symmetrical pawn structure in the center while also activating a rook for potential central control or flank operations. Recentralizing the rook on the open e-file signifies a strategic shift, aiming to contest this vital artery and disrupt white's developing harmony rather than immediately creating overt threats. Disrupting black's pawn structure is the primary goal, creating weaknesses that could prove troublesome later, especially around the king's vicinity once the central tension is resolved. This captures the pawn, regaining material balance but opening the d-file and c-file, creating immediate avenues for white's queen and rook if they can be positioned effectively. Black now has doubled pawns on the c-file, a potential weakness that might become a target in the middle game, but also activates the queen's influence towards the center. This queen repositioning aims to exploit the doubled pawns on the c-file, creating immediate pressure and a target for future attacks, while also securing the queen on an active diagonal. A bold assertion of central influence, bringing the queen into a dynamic skirmish and directly challenging white's queen's position. Developing the bishop to this diagonal opens up significant attacking possibilities, directly pressuring black's queen and hinting at a potential queenside expansion, while simultaneously reinforcing white's central presence. Challenging the bishop directly by bringing the knight to a central square, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed position of white's queen and create immediate tactical possibilities. Harnessing the open d-file now solidifies white's central presence and provides immediate leverage for the rooks to exert pressure on black's potentially weakened queenside pawn structure after the dxc6 recapture. Black seeks to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially open lines for their pieces. This pawn advance challenges white's plan of potentially expanding on that side of the board with moves like b4. Consider how this pawn's presence might influence the control of the b4 square and potentially create outposts for black's pieces on c4 if white is not careful. Challenging the knight's advanced outpost with a pawn advance clears the way for the bishop's potential retreat, while simultaneously creating a defensive screen and a slight pawn structure alteration on the kingside. Reclaiming central influence and opening avenues for piece redistribution, This knight embarks on a journey to challenge white's established pawn structure and potentially exploit the now weakened dark squares around the king. Establishing control over the central files is the immediate objective, fortifying the d-file for potential future advances and creating a more robust defensive structure around the king. Propping up the g7 bishop is a sensible, if somewhat passive, defensive measure, acknowledging the potential pressure along the open d-file and the looming threat of the white queen on b3. This pawn push creates a slight structural weakness, a small concession in exchange for immediate safety, potentially anticipating a later pawn break or aiming to restrict white's kingside options. By preventing the immediate advance of white's h-pawn, black shores up the kingside, but at the cost of a potential weakening of the dark squares around the king. A moment of strategic caution, this move prioritizes king safety over immediate counterplay, a common theme when facing a well-coordinated attacking formation. This pawn advance might signal an intention to gradually improve piece placement, perhaps preparing for a maneuver of the knight or the rook, even if it doesn't immediately change the tactical picture. Opening up the queenside flank with this pawn thrust drastically alters the pawn structure, creating immediate tension and forcing black to reassess their queenside development and defensive setup. Embracing the queenside challenge, this piece repositions to contest the expanding pawn center, aiming to disrupt white's spatial advantage and potentially create counterplay along the now open diagonal. Unleashing a positional squeeze, white repositions the queen to the attacking flank, aiming to exploit the slight overextension on black's queenside and potentially isolate weaknesses that have emerged. Embracing the c4 square with the knight injects immediate dynamism, challenging white's advanced pawn and eyeing the light-squared weakness on d2. This aggressive outpost, however, risks isolation if white can effectively dislodge it, potentially leading to a compromised pawn structure down the line. Clearing the way for the king's rook, white repositions the queen to a more active square, eyeing potential weaknesses on the queenside and preparing to contest the crucial c-file. Aggressively seeking to undermine white's queenside pawn structure, this move injects a volatile dynamic into the position, potentially opening lines towards the king, but also creating significant weaknesses. Repositioning the bishop to d2 aims to consolidate the queenside pawn structure, anticipating potential incursions on the c-file while simultaneously preparing to challenge black's advanced g-pawn with a future e4 push, thereby reclaiming central space and aiming to restrict black's piece activity. Reclaiming central influence and opening lines for attack, black boldly initiates a trade of pieces, aiming to simplify the position and potentially expose white's queen. Reclaiming the queen, white initiates a central pawn push to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain, aiming to seize control of key diagonals and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the black king. Reclaiming the pawn on c5 immediately reestablishes material equality, but at a cost. The queenside pawns are now fragmented, presenting potential targets for white's rooks on the open c-file. The recapture also centralizes black's queen, which could be advantageous, yet it simultaneously allows white's bishop on f4 to become more active, potentially eyeing the d6 square. This dynamic exchange injects fresh tactical possibilities and positional considerations into the game, transforming it from a quiet buildup into a more fluid struggle where precise calculation will be paramount. Steering the knight to the queenside aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit the newly created weaknesses. Exploring the intricate geometry of the queenside, this maneuver skillfully redirects the queen to a more active, albeit potentially exposed, square, aiming to disrupt white's central control and perhaps pry open the queenside pawns. Challenging black's pawn chain, white's knight pivots to a more aggressive square, aiming to disrupt the opponent's queenside structure and potentially exploit the weakened c-file if black's pieces don't coordinate perfectly. Unburdening the queen streamlines black's defensive structure, potentially setting the stage for a more active piece play in the upcoming middle game or end game by simplifying the board. Recapturing the queen on d2 solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares to contest the crucial d-file, hinting at a potential endgame advantage where coordinated pieces on open lines can be decisive. A bold repositioning attempt, aiming to bring the bishop back into play and contest the d2 square, but it leaves the queenside pawns somewhat vulnerable to further pressure. A strategic repositioning, aiming to reclaim active influence over the central files that have become somewhat passive. Understanding the geometry of this endgame is paramount. The rooks now eye the d-file with renewed purpose, seeking to exploit any potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure or king's safety. Notice how the doubled pawns on the c-file, though creating a potential weakness, also grant black's pawns some defensive capabilities. White's objective is to create threats that demand black's attention, forcing concessions or enabling tactical opportunities. This maneuver is about building pressure patiently, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The open lines created by previous exchanges are now white's to dominate. Black's pawn thrust to a4, while seemingly aggressive, overextends on the queen side and potentially weakens the pawn chain, creating a target for white's rooks to exploit. Asserting control over the central files is paramount here, and this move aims to solidify that dominance by contesting the open c-file, potentially preparing to challenge black's piece activity and prepare for a more favorable endgame transition. The rook now activates along the 5th rank, seeking a way to penetrate white's queenside pawn structure and create potential weaknesses. Sharpening the grip on the central files, the rook's repositioning prepares to contest the open c-file, a crucial artery for future play, while simultaneously defending the d2 rook and subtly discouraging black's queenside expansion. Re-establishing a pawn chain's defensive integrity on the queenside, the bishop retreats to an active diagonal, seeking potential influence over the b7 and c5 squares while preparing to contest the central light-squared control that white's rook currently enjoys. Reasserting central influence, the knight now eyes potentially weakened dark squares while preparing to reroute towards the queenside, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and creating a new point of attack. Safeguarding the monarch becomes paramount as black tucks the king away from the open files, a prudent retreat to consolidate defensive structures and prepare for potential future skirmishes on the king side or center. Reclaiming the initiative, white's knight repositions to a more central square, aiming to improve piece activity and contest the now more open queen side. The bishop vacates its post on e6, anticipating a potential pawn push on c5, but this also opens a diagonal for white's queen and potentially weakens the dark squares around black's king, especially if the c-pawn advances further. Reigniting pressure on the e-file, white seeks to disrupt black's consolidated pawn structure and potentially exploit the pinned bishop on e6. Pushing the pawn forward like this is a bold gambit, potentially creating a passed pawn, but also leaving the file vulnerable to occupation by the rook. Securing the queenside pawn majority, this maneuver initiates a slow territorial expansion, aiming to eventually build a passed pawn from the flank while stabilizing the position against any immediate royal intrusion. Securing that open file offers a lifeline, but be mindful of the pawn's structure's vulnerability down the queenside. You've traded active piece play for a potentially passive defense that could leave you outmaneuvered if not handled with precision. Shattering the flank's tranquility, this pawn thrust aims to pry open the kingside and exploit any lingering defensive weaknesses around black's monarch. Opening the d-file presents a direct challenge, forcing white to decide how to defend their compromised pawn structure. Ignoring it invites substantial pressure. Pivoting the rook to the 4th rank now aims to disrupt black's advancing kingside pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's pieces by exploiting the slightly exposed black king. The rook's forced retreat signifies the surrender of the open d-file, a significant concession that opens up avenues for white's pieces and complicates black's defensive structure, potentially leading to a passive endgame position where white's rook can become a dominant force on the central file. The exchange of rooks fundamentally alters the dynamic, simplifying the battlefield and ushering in an endgame where pawn structure and minor piece activity become paramount. Black's bishop, now free from its pawn chains, seeks active placement, eyeing potential weaknesses on the kingside and offering support for any future pawn advances. Securing the rook's penetration along the fourth rank, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit the open lines now available for white's pieces. Re-establishing the rook on its natural highway, this repositioning aims to pierce the white defenses along the d-file, potentially setting up a future breakthrough or a crucial exchange that favors black's active pieces in the currently static board. Unlocking the h-file creates a powerful attacking avenue, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside structure after black's recent pawn advances. Exposing the king's defenses by opening the h-file might seem tempting for aggressive play, but it also grants white's rook immediate access to a vulnerable sector of your queenside. Securing the queenside pawn chain's stability becomes paramount now, preventing black from infiltrating or disrupting white's intended endgame structure with any further queenside play. A calculated retreat to safety, redeploying the bishop to a less exposed square, avoiding potential pawn advances and preparing to support the advance of the isolated pawn. Initiating a positional maneuver to seize control of the central files and pressure black's isolated pawn on c6. The king suddenly finds itself exposed on the open central files, a direct consequence of black's aggressive pawn advances and white's subsequent retreat. Unveiling your king from its shelter, a bold gambit to sidestep the persistent threats along the open files and potentially unblock the activity of your remaining pieces. The rook's re-entry onto the fourth rank, a quiet maneuver, aims to exploit the compromised pawn structure and the exposed white king, potentially setting up a decisive infiltration or a positional squeeze. Seizing the isolated pawn offers a temporary material advantage, but at the cost of exposing your king further and potentially creating weaknesses in your pawn structure as the rooks become more active. Grabbing that pawn might look tempting, but the immediate consequence is opening up the rook on the 8th rank to participate fully in the defense of your own king, a king now potentially exposed by the pawn structure you've allowed. The rook's maneuver to the flank aggressively contests the open file, aiming to dislodge black's entrenched bishop and gain a foothold on the queenside. Solidifying the pawn structure with f6 now looks prudent, preventing any immediate pawn thrusts from white's rooks or knight that could destabilize your queen's rook. Securing the pawn on e3 prevents black's rook from gaining further influence on the d-file and subtly reinforces white's kingside pawn structure, a small but crucial step towards solidifying white's position as the endgame begins to take shape. The rook's retreat here, abandoning the open file it just fought for, sacrifices valuable tempo and concedes the initiative to white's rooks who are now poised to dominate the central files. Embracing the open file now presents a crucial opportunity to disrupt black's defensive structure, potentially forcing a pawn to advance prematurely and creating weaknesses. Aggressively pushing the pawn here initiates a dramatic pawn race that could prove perilous given the exposed black king and the precariousness of white's queenside majority. The rook now boldly occupies the 5th rank, creating immediate threats to the isolated pawns and opening up tactical possibilities against black's king. Pushing the king into the center of action, the black monarch boldly steps forward, embracing the potential for an active endgame role as pawns are exchanged on the flank, signaling a shift towards peace play and potential mating threats. The knight leaps forward, aiming to disrupt black's precarious pawn structure and potentially target the exposed king. Finally, the pesky bishop is out of the way, allowing the king to breathe a little more freely in this endgame scenario. Exchanging rooks on the c-file simplifies to an endgame where white's active rook on the 7th rank becomes a significant long-term threat, aiming to infiltrate the black position and create unstoppable passed pawns. The rook on f2 now awakens, targeting white's vulnerable pawns on the kingside while the other rook defends the passed pawn. The king scurries for safety amidst the chaos, seeking refuge on the kingside after the rook's aggressive thrust. Seeking to activate the rook, this maneuver sacrifices pawn structure to force white's king further from the center and open lines for counterplay. Pressing the advantage, white advances the pawn to seize more territory and restrict black's pieces. a desperate attempt to expose the white king, though the material deficit makes this check more of a gesture than a serious threat given the open king's safety. The monarch now scurries to safety, seeking refuge from the open lines and the menacing pressure the opponent's pawns exert. The rook's foray to the second rank disrupts white's carefully constructed pawn chain, forcing a reaction that may weaken the king's defenses. The king retreats to a safer square, disengaging from the immediate threats on the back rank, a crucial defensive maneuver as the material becomes increasingly balanced and pawn structure considerations become paramount. Returning the rook to the now open second rank offers a fresh perspective, potentially reinforcing the central pawn structure or eyeing those vulnerable white pawns on the king side. Unleashing the central pawns opens a dynamic fight, aiming to shatter black's defensive pawn chain and exploit the compromised king position that has emerged from the exchange. Unleashing the pawn storm, black seeks to disrupt white's king's safety by opening lines, a desperate gambit given the exposed nature of the monarch and the encroaching pawns that will soon be easy targets. Opening the g-file creates a dynamic imbalance, introducing critical attacking possibilities against the black king that were previously unavailable, while simultaneously forcing black to reevaluate pawn structure weaknesses. The pawn's advance, a desperate bid for counterplay, fundamentally alters the landscape by opening lines, but also exposes a critical weakness on the king side. Activating the bishop to its most aggressive diagonal, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and pressure the weak pawn structure. Fulfilling the king's desire for activity, this repositioning seeks to bring the monarch into the fray, potentially supporting the queenside pawns or even joining an attack on white's vulnerable king in the long run. Unlocking the pawn chain's potential, this advance aims to shatter black's defensive structure and expose the weak f4 pawn. Seeking active piece play, black nudges the bishop to a more central square, eyeing potential central pawn breaks or simply improving its scope. Pivoting the king towards the queenside offers the best chance to support the advanced pawns and potentially activate the rook on the file, aiming for a more cohesive defensive structure against black's encroaching pieces. Unleashing the rook towards the queenside suddenly transforms the strategic landscape, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay where none seemed immediately apparent. Initiating a slow but potentially decisive repositioning of the monarch to a more active central square. A bold attempt to activate the rook on a now crucial open file, hoping to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps create some counterplay, though it risks overextending and leaving itself vulnerable. Propelling the pawn forward relentlessly exploits the weakened dark squares along black's queenside, aiming to force a passed pawn that will dominate the endgame. The capture on a6 initiates an endgame where black's isolated pawn structure presents a significant long-term weakness, even though it simplifies the material. Securing the pawn on c6 disrupts black's pawn structure and aims to exploit the newly created weakness, potentially opening lines for white's rook on the c-file while simplifying the position towards an advantageous endgame. Reclaiming the central square, the bishop now eyes the vulnerable white king, aiming to exploit the open files for potential pawn advances or piece activity. The rook's relocation to the sixth rank decisively targets the compromised queenside pawn structure, aiming to exploit black's isolated pawns and secure a decisive material advantage. The rook's relocation to e5 initiates a desperate attempt to disrupt white's newfound advantage by targeting the weakened pawn structure on the e-file, hoping to create counterplay where none truly exists. Forces the black king to become exposed, sacrificing pawn structure for a temporary attack that won't materialize. The white king is now exposed, begging for the rook to join the attack along the seventh rank. The rook's repositioning to the seventh rank immediately applies immense pressure on black's compromised pawn structure and exposed king. A surprising pawn advance, pushing into enemy territory, potentially disrupting the white king's already compromised defensive setup. The king cautiously steps into the fray, aiming to participate in the pawn race and potentially support the remaining material, though it faces some exposure on the open board. The rook's foray to the king's flank, aiming to support the advancing pawn and potentially disrupt white's pawn chain, introduces a dynamic element, though it risks becoming isolated if white can consolidate their central superiority. The king, no longer a passive spectator, steps boldly onto the active battlefield, aiming to rally the weakened pawns and usher in a decisive endgame assault. The rook's repositioning to the open file creates an immediate threat on the 7th rank, potentially isolating white's vulnerable pawns. A timely rook repositioning, seeking to occupy that open file and threaten the pawn on b4, while simultaneously creating a strong defensive post. The bishop's retreat to the queenside squares effectively abandons the kingside, a significant positional concession as white's rook now enjoys unchallenged dominance on the 7th rank, preparing to infiltrate and exploit any defensive weakness. Activating the king in this rook and pawn endgame is paramount, as it shifts from a passive bystander to a crucial fighting piece. Opening a new avenue for the black rook to attack the white queenside pawns, while simultaneously creating a potential passed pawn on the file if the exchange on can be forced. The king steps forward, seeking safety and ready to support the rook's endeavors, a crucial step in this tense endgame dance where every tempo counts. The rook repositions itself to a potentially active square, eyeing the pawn structure and preparing for any further advancements or defensive maneuvers in this complex endgame phase. The rook's aggressive thrust checks the king, forcing it to abandon its protective pawn shield and opening a path for white's pieces to further exploit the exposed monarch. The rook's journey to the 4th rank, though it feels active, is a bit of a detour, perhaps overlooking the immediate threat to its king's sanctuary. It sacrifices valuable tempo, allowing white's monarch to solidify and potentially prepare a counterthrust on the kingside. This passive repositioning offers little in the way of immediate tactical disruption and invites white to consolidate their material advantage with further probing moves. The rook's arrival on the 7th rank forces the opposing king into a more exposed position, a classic technique to restrict enemy piece mobility and prepare for decisive action. That knight's repositioning offers a glimmer of hope, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside. A checking maneuver forces a positional concession and opens the door to pawn promotion. The rook's journey along the 7th rank now seeks refuge on the queenside, away from the immediate firing line of white's advanced king and pawns, aiming to consolidate its position and potentially prepare for a counterthrust down the queenside files. Capturing the pawn opens up the file for your rook, which will become a powerful tool for harassment and potential breakthroughs in this endgame. Seizing the open file is a pivotal decision, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create an outpost for the rook. The king ventures from its safe haven, aiming to participate in the pawn storm that's brewing on the queenside. A sudden thrust of the rook to the queenside aims to disrupt white's already precarious pawn structure and create a passed pawn on the file, a desperate but potentially fruitful strategy in this endgame. King Hunt initiated with a check, forcing the black monarch to a less secure square and aiming to consolidate the rook's dominance on the open 7th rank. The king, feeling the pressure on the queenside, seeks refuge, but this approach to the corner might expose it further to white's advancing pawns and potential checks. Securing the rook on the open file halts black's aggressive pawn push and begins the process of repositioning the rook for better defensive coverage or potential counterplay on the queenside. Pushing the pawn to a 2 activates the rook, but now it's a sitting duck, potentially losing a tempo as the white king can simply sidestep the threat.